Airports are places of movement. Every single day, hundreds of thousands of people pass through them. They carry suitcases full of clothes, phones full of memories, and hearts full of every emotion imaginable: excitement, grief, anticipation, longing. Most people in an airport are thinking about where they're going. But on a cold Tuesday morning in November, inside one of the most crowded terminals at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, one woman wasn't thinking about her destination at all. She was thinking about survival. And in less than 60 seconds, a single glance across a terminal crowded with strangers was about to change the direction of more than one life forever. Her name was Rachel Monroe. She was 37 years old, a former elementary school teacher from suburban Atlanta, and she had spent the last 9 months doing something most people spend their entire lives too afraid to do. She had walked away. Away from a marriage that looked perfect from the outside. Away from a house with a manicured lawn and a kitchen that smelled like fresh coffee every morning. Away from a man who had once been the most charming person she had ever met, but who had slowly, quietly, methodically turned her world into a prison with no visible walls. She had finally gotten out. She had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, in a new city. She had a new job. A new apartment. A new flight. And she was on her way to see her sister in Portland for the first time in 3 years. She was standing near gate H14, her carry-on bag hanging from her right shoulder, a coffee cup warming her left hand, when she looked up. And everything inside her went cold. He was there. Marcus Webb. Standing no more than 60 feet away, near the departures board, wearing a navy blue coat she recognized immediately. He hadn't seen her yet. His head was turned slightly to the left. But Rachel knew, with the bone-deep certainty that only years of watching someone's every movement can give you, that the moment he turned his head, he would find her. Because Marcus Webb always found her. That was the one thing he had never failed at. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She did what fear sometimes makes the body do before the mind catches up. She stepped sideways, quickly, instinctively, directly behind the person standing nearest to her. A tall man in a dark coat. Calm. Still. Completely unaware of what had just placed itself behind him. Rachel pressed close, lowered her head, and tried to slow her breathing. She didn't know who the man was. She didn't know his name, his history, or the kind of world he moved through when he wasn't standing in an airport terminal. What she did know was this: she needed to disappear, and he was the closest wall she had. What she could not have known, not in 1,000 guesses, was that the man she had chosen to hide behind was James Park. And in certain circles, circles that most people never come anywhere near, James Park was not a man you hid behind. He was the man others hid from. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's talk about what you need to understand before this story fully makes sense. Because this isn't a simple story about a woman running from a bad relationship. This is a story about what happens when the worst moment of your life collides with forces so far outside your understanding that you can't even begin to calculate the odds. This is a story about 3 people, each carrying a weight the others knew nothing about. And it's a story about what an airport flight manifest, a document most of us never even think about, can reveal when the right person decides to look. Who was Rachel Monroe, and what had she left behind in Atlanta? Who was Marcus Webb, truly, beneath the tailored suits and the country club handshake? And who, in the name of everything rational, was James Park, and why did he, a man with every reason to ignore the frightened woman pressing herself against his back, give a single quiet command to his team that set off a chain of events neither of them could have anticipated? These are the questions this story answers. And the answers are going to surprise you. Because the truth, as it so often does, turned out to be far more layered than anyone on that terminal floor could have imagined. Rachel Monroe grew up in a mid-sized town in Tennessee. She was the second of 3 daughters in a family that didn't have much money but had plenty of warmth. Her mother taught Sunday school. Her father fixed HVAC units for a living and came home every evening smelling like motor oil and fried food from the diner where he always stopped on his way back. Rachel was the quiet one. The sister who read thick paperback novels under her covers with a flashlight, who drew maps of imaginary countries on graph paper, who wanted, above everything else, to understand how people worked. That curiosity eventually led her to a degree in early childhood education from the University of Tennessee. She moved to Atlanta at 24, got a job at a Title I elementary school in the Westview neighborhood, and spent the next 3 years learning that the most important thing you can give a child isn't knowledge, it's the feeling that someone sees them. She met Marcus Webb at a friend's dinner party on a rainy Saturday in October, 6 years before the morning at O'Hare. He was 39, handsome in a quiet, deliberate way, and he had the kind of attentiveness that made you feel like the only person in the room. He asked Rachel about her students. He leaned in when she talked. He remembered, at their second dinner a week later, the name of the little boy she had mentioned who refused to speak above a whisper in class. That kind of detail. That kind of listening. It felt, at the time, like being truly known. What Rachel didn't yet understand, what she would spend the next several years slowly, painfully learning, was that there is a difference between someone who listens because they care, and someone who listens because information is power. They married 18 months after they met. The wedding was small, beautiful, and held in a garden outside Decatur. Rachel wore a cream-colored dress she had found in a vintage shop on Moreland Avenue. Her mother cried. Her father danced with her to a song by Otis Redding. For a while, for a real, genuine while, things were good. But somewhere in the third year, something shifted. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It was the way Marcus would go quiet when she mentioned having lunch with a colleague. The way he started calling her cell phone if she was more than 20 minutes late getting home. The way the finances became, somehow, something he handled alone, because he was better with numbers, he explained, and because it just made sense, he explained, and because it was easier this way, he explained, until one day Rachel realized she had no access to the account their combined salaries went into. She stopped telling people at work that things were difficult. She stopped calling her sister, Diane, as often as she used to. She told herself these were normal adjustments. That every marriage had rough patches. That Marcus loved her, even when the love felt more like a fence than a feeling. It was her second-grade student, a 7-year-old girl named Amara, who cracked something open in Rachel's chest on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. Amara had walked up to Rachel's desk during free reading and said, very quietly, "Miss Monroe, do you know that you don't have to stay somewhere that makes you feel small?" 7 years old. Rachel had gone home that night, sat in the guest bathroom with the door locked, and cried for 40 minutes. 3 months later, she had a plan. And 9 months before that Tuesday morning at O'Hare, she had executed it, leaving while Marcus was on a business trip to Charlotte, taking only what fit in 2 bags, and driving north to Chicago where her college roommate had offered her a couch and a fresh start. To the people who knew Marcus Webb socially, he was exactly the kind of man you wanted to have a beer with and then maybe do business with someday. He was a commercial real estate consultant with an office in Buckhead, a firm handshake, and a reputation for being meticulous, the kind of guy who always followed up, always delivered on time, always had the right answer ready. His neighbors described him as quiet but polite. His colleagues called him reliable. His clients called him sharp. None of these people were wrong, exactly. But none of them knew what Rachel knew. None of them had seen what happened behind the closed doors of the house in Sandy Springs. None of them had felt the shift in atmospheric pressure that occurred whenever Marcus felt that something, or someone, was moving outside his control. What very few people knew, and what would only come to light much later, was that Marcus Webb's consulting business had, over the past 4 years, developed a second layer of operation that had nothing to do with commercial real estate. He had become, through a series of quiet introductions at private events, a financial facilitator. A man who helped move certain funds through legitimate business structures in ways that kept those funds looking clean. He wasn't a violent man. He wasn't a gangster in the cinematic sense of the word. But he moved at the edges of networks that were. And those networks had a rule that every person inside them understood without needing to be told: you do not allow someone who knows your structure to simply walk away. Rachel didn't know about any of this when she left. She barely knew about it even now, waiting in a Chicago airport terminal with cold coffee and a boarding pass in her hand. But Marcus knew that she knew enough. And that was more than sufficient. James Park was born in Incheon, South Korea, and came to the United States with his family at the age of 9. His father ran a dry cleaning business in Koreatown, Los Angeles. His mother worked nights at a hospital laundry facility. James was the oldest of 4 children, and from a very young age he carried himself with a stillness that people either found comforting or deeply unnerving, depending on who they were and what they had done. He was, by all documented accounts, an exceptional student, full scholarship to UCLA, economics degree, then a master's in international finance from Georgetown. By his early 30s, he ran a legitimate import-export holding company with offices in Chicago, Los Angeles, and Seoul, and sat on the boards of 2 charitable foundations. His public profile was spotless. But there is a version of James Park that the holding company website does not mention. A version that emerged not through ambition or greed, but through something far older and more complicated: loyalty. When James was 22, his youngest brother was targeted by a Korean loan shark network operating out of a restaurant supply business in Koreatown. His brother had borrowed money, the situation had spiraled, and the people involved had made clear, in very physical terms, that they intended to collect in ways that went beyond dollars. James had handled it. He doesn't talk about how. But the people who needed to know, knew. And over the next decade, as his legitimate business grew, so did a parallel reputation, as a man of strategy, discretion, and absolute reliability when it came to protecting the people he considered his own. He wasn't known for warmth. He was known, in certain rooms, for something that people in those rooms consider far more valuable: he was known for his word. What James Park said, he meant. What James Park committed to, he delivered. And on that Tuesday morning at O'Hare, standing near gate H-14 with 2 members of his team beside him, James Park had no intention of being involved in anyone else's story. That was, until he felt the slight, unmistakable pressure of someone pressing against the back of his. James Park didn't move when he felt her behind him. That was the first thing. A lesser man would have turned around immediately, out of surprise, irritation, confusion. James didn't. He simply became aware, the way a person becomes aware of weather changing, and he waited 1 beat, then 2, before turning his head just slightly to the left, not enough to face her, just enough to register her presence in his peripheral vision. What he saw was a woman. 30s. Medium height. Brown coat, dark jeans, carry-on bag. Her eyes were fixed across the terminal with the kind of locked, unblinking focus that James Park recognized immediately, because he had seen that look on people before, and it only ever meant one thing. That woman was not looking at something. She was tracking something. And whatever she was tracking terrified her. He didn't speak to her right away. He scanned the area in the direction of her gaze, moving with the unhurried patience of someone who has spent years learning to read a room the way other people read a newspaper. And then he saw him. Navy coat. Tall. Early 40s. The man was standing near the departures board, and he was, even now, beginning to turn his head slowly in their direction. James noted the posture, the measured, deliberate quality of the man's stillness. He noted the way the man's eyes moved, not the darting eyes of a casual traveler checking flight times, but the systematic, grid-like scan of someone looking for a specific target. James had seen that before too. He glanced briefly at his associate, Danny Cho, who stood 2 feet to his right. Danny had also been watching. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. It was then that Rachel, still pressed behind James, whispered. Her voice was so low it was almost not a voice at all, barely more than breath shaped into words. "Please," she said. "Please don't let him see me." James didn't answer immediately. He didn't make promises he hadn't thought through. Instead, he shifted, one small, deliberate half-step to the left, placing himself more squarely between Rachel and the man across the terminal. Then he spoke, quietly, to Danny. Not looking at him. Not raising his voice by a single degree. 2 words. The manifest. Danny Cho pulled out his phone. And on the other side of that quiet exchange, an entirely separate sequence of events began to move. You have to understand what the manifest meant in this context. Commercial airline passenger manifests are not public documents. They are internal records, names, seat assignments, passport details, booking origins, available only to the airline, to law enforcement with proper authorization, and, in certain circumstances involving certain kinds of people with certain kinds of reach, to individuals with very specific relationships to people inside those systems. James Park had spent 20 years building relationships with precision. He didn't abuse them. He rarely used them for anything personal. But when he said, the manifest, everyone in his small team understood that he was activating a channel, one that would, within minutes, tell him exactly who had booked a ticket on the same flight as the woman standing behind him, where that person had booked it from, and when. Meanwhile, Rachel was doing everything she could to hold herself together. She had stopped breathing at the normal rate. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears, the way it gets when your body has flooded itself with adrenaline and there's nowhere to put it. She could smell the faint scent of cedar and something clean, probably the coat of the man she was hiding behind, and she focused on that smell the way a drowning person focuses on a piece of wood. She told herself she just needed to make it to the gate. Just get through the gate and onto the plane. Marcus couldn't follow her onto the plane without a boarding pass. She just needed to not be seen for a little longer. But even as she thought this, some part of her, the part that had spent 4 years learning to read Marcus Webb, knew that if he was here, he already had a boarding pass. Because Marcus Webb did not show up anywhere unprepared. Across the terminal, Marcus had completed his scan. He hadn't found her yet. But he had narrowed it down. He began walking, not quickly, not in a way that drew attention, but with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who is absolutely certain of his eventual outcome. He moved through the crowd at an angle, eliminating quadrants the way you eliminate answers on a test when you know the logic well enough. He had a gift for this. He had always had a gift for this. 3 years into their marriage, Rachel had once tried to visit her sister in Portland without telling him, a spontaneous trip, bought on a Tuesday, flown on a Thursday. He had been at the Portland airport when she landed. She had never understood how. She understood now, a little better, that it wasn't love that had put him there. Danny Cho stepped slightly away from the group and made a call. The call lasted 47 seconds. Then he walked back to James and spoke directly into his ear. James's expression did not change. It almost never did. But something in the set of his jaw shifted, the microscopic tightening that people who knew him well had learned to read as significance. He turned his head, just slightly, and spoke without looking back at Rachel. You're on the 11:45 to Portland. It wasn't a question. Rachel's breath caught. She whispered yes. James said, very quietly, so is he. The silence that followed that sentence was only about 2 seconds long. But inside those 2 seconds, Rachel Monroe understood, completely, finally, and with a clarity that felt almost like calm, that Marcus had not stumbled into this airport. He had followed her here. He knew her flight. He had booked a seat. And he intended to be on that plane with her. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means to live inside a situation where someone who was supposed to love you has instead dedicated their resources, their time, and their very considerable intelligence to tracking your every movement. We talk a lot about control in relationships, in therapy language, in self-help books, in social media posts with clean graphics and easy answers. But what Rachel was experiencing was not a category. It was a physical reality, standing 60 feet away in a navy blue coat, getting closer. If you've ever felt genuinely afraid of someone who was supposed to care for you, If you've ever stood somewhere that should have felt safe and felt your throat close up because they were near, then you already know exactly what Rachel Monroe was feeling in that moment. And if you haven't, count that as one of the quieter gifts of your life. We'd genuinely love to know. Drop in the comments what you would have done if you were standing in Rachel's shoes right now. Would you have run? Would you have called security? Or would you have done exactly what she did, trusted a complete stranger and prayed it wasn't a mistake? James made a decision in those few seconds that, by his own later admission, surprised even him. He was not an impulsive man. Impulsive people don't survive long in the world he moved through. Every action he took was preceded by a rapid but thorough calculation: cost, exposure, benefit, exit. The rational calculation said, "This is not your problem. You don't know this woman. You have a flight to catch, a meeting in Seoul in 31 hours, and an obligation to your team that doesn't include absorbing the domestic complications of a stranger." The rational calculation was clear. And he ignored it. Because in 43 years of living, James Park had seen the particular look on Rachel Monroe's face exactly once before, on the face of his own mother, standing in their kitchen in Los Angeles when James was 12 years old, while a man who owed his father money stood in the doorway and smiled in a way that had nothing kind in it. James didn't make decisions from emotion. But he had learned, a very long time ago, to recognize when something mattered. He gave Danny a second instruction. Brief. Precise. Within 90 seconds, Danny had relocated to a position approximately 15 feet from Marcus Webb's current location, close enough to observe, far enough to be invisible. James's second associate, a quiet man named Victor who spoke very little and noticed everything, moved to cover the second corridor that led to gate H14. And James himself turned, slowly, naturally, as if he were simply adjusting his position while waiting, and for the first time, he looked directly at Rachel. She was watching him with wide, exhausted eyes, the kind of eyes that have been afraid for so long they've almost forgotten what the alternative feels like. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, in the same quiet, level voice he used for everything, "Walk with me. Stay on my left." Rachel didn't ask questions. She had gotten good, in the years since Atlanta, at trusting her instincts about people, because ignoring her instincts had cost her so much before. Something in the quality of James Park's stillness, not coldness, not indifference, but a kind of grounded, settled authority, told her that this was not a man who said things he didn't mean. She picked up her carry-on bag and walked on his left side as they moved, at a normal pace, toward the gate. She didn't look back. She was afraid that if she looked back she would see Marcus looking directly at her, and she wasn't sure her legs would keep moving if that happened. She focused on the floor ahead. The gray tile. The overhead announcements. The smell of that cedar coat. One step, and then the next. Back in the terminal, Danny Cho was watching Marcus Webb very carefully. And what Danny saw was interesting. Marcus had slowed his scanning. He had moved to a different position near the gate area, not gate H14, but close to it. He was scanning the seated waiting area with increasing deliberateness, the way someone does when they've narrowed a search to a specific zone and are now doing a thorough sweep. But here was the thing, and Danny noted this and relayed it back in a brief text message to James. Marcus Webb was doing this with one hand in his coat pocket, and his phone in the other hand, and he was glancing at his phone with the regularity of someone who was receiving updates. Location updates. Which meant Marcus had a way of tracking Rachel's phone. Which meant this wasn't just coincidence or even careful preparation. This was active surveillance. James received Danny's text message while standing near the gate. He read it once, then put his phone in his pocket. He glanced at Rachel, who was sitting in one of the gate seats, her carry-on between her feet, her hands clasped tight in her lap. He sat down beside her, leaving one seat between them, and spoke without making it look like a conversation. "Is your phone in your bag?" Rachel said yes. "Take the battery out," he said. "Or turn it fully off, airplane mode isn't enough." Rachel stared at him. She said, "How did you know about the phone?" He didn't answer the question directly. He said only, "Do you want to get on that plane?" She said yes. He said, "Then trust me on the phone." She took her phone out, looked at it for a moment like she was looking at something that had betrayed her, and then powered it completely off. 60 seconds later, across the terminal, Marcus Webb looked at his own phone. He stopped walking. He looked at the screen again. Then he made a call. His voice was low and controlled, the voice of a man who is accustomed to being the calmest person in a crisis he himself has created. He said to whoever answered, "She went dark. Find her at the gate." Then he hung up. What Marcus did not know, what he had no way of knowing, was that Danny Cho was standing 11 feet behind him and had heard every word. And Danny, who had worked alongside James Park for 9 years and had an instinctive understanding of when a situation had just shifted from manageable to serious, sent one message back to James. 3 words. "He's got backup." James received the message. He sat for 3 seconds without moving. Then he stood up, walked to the gate counter, and had a brief, quiet conversation with the airline agent, a woman in her 50s with a name tag that said Karen. We don't know exactly what James said to Karen, and Karen, if she remembers the conversation at all, has never discussed it. What we know is that the conversation lasted about 90 seconds, and that when James returned to the seating area, he told Rachel, very calmly, that boarding had been quietly reorganized and that she would be the first passenger on the jetway. He also told her that what he was about to do would resolve the immediate problem, but that she needed to understand something important. Marcus Webb was not just a controlling ex-husband. He was connected to people who would not simply give up because she had gotten on a plane. Rachel sat very still when he said this. She said, "I think I know." And then, slowly, she told James something she had not told anyone in the 9 months since she had left Atlanta. She told him about the flash drive. 7 months before she left, she had been looking for their tax documents on Marcus's laptop. Their accountant had requested a specific form, and Rachel had been alone in Marcus's home office when she found the folder. She hadn't gone looking for anything unusual. She had just been trying to find a PDF. But the folder she opened by mistake wasn't a tax folder. It was a structured record of financial transactions, dozens of them, flowing through shell companies with addresses in Nevada, Delaware, and 2 international locations. The amounts were large. The documentation was meticulous. And the names attached to the transactions were not names she recognized from any legitimate business Marcus had ever mentioned. She had copied the folder to a flash drive, almost without thinking, and then closed everything and gone back to the kitchen as if nothing had happened. James was quiet for a moment after she said this. Then he said, "That's why he's here." And the way he said it, flat, certain, without even a trace of surprise, told Rachel something important about the man sitting near her. He wasn't shocked by what she had just described. He was confirming something he had already begun to suspect. Think about that. Think about what it means that a stranger, a man with no prior knowledge of Rachel Monroe or Marcus Webb, had, within minutes of observing Marcus's behavior in that terminal, already understood that the situation was not simply personal. That the man in the navy coat wasn't just a jealous husband who couldn't let go. He was someone operating with purpose. Someone who had something to lose. Someone for whom Rachel was not just a person he wanted back, she was a problem he needed to contain. Does that change how you feel about Rachel's decision to leave? Because it should. She didn't just walk out of a difficult marriage. She walked out of something much larger, and she did it with almost no information about what she was actually walking away from. Meanwhile, James's team had been busy. The manifest check had returned more than just Marcus's name and seat number. It had flagged a second name, a man booked under a different last name but with a travel history that Danny, who knew what to look for, recognized as part of a pattern. Same flight. Seat booked 3 hours after Marcus's booking, 48 hours ago. A scout, almost certainly, someone positioned to observe and report rather than act directly. This was not the behavior of a man trying to reconcile with an estranged wife. This was an operational deployment. And James Park, who had spent 20 years learning the difference between personal disputes and organized problems, understood that what had begun as a strange moment in a terminal had now placed him at the intersection of something considerably more complex. He made 3 phone calls in the next 12 minutes. The third call, to a contact whose connection to the Federal Aviation Security Apparatus is not something we will speculate about here, produced results within 20 minutes. 2 plainclothes officials entered the H concourse from the service corridor on the east side of the terminal. Here is where everything that seemed to be one story reveals itself to be a different story entirely. Because up to this point, if you've been following carefully, you might have constructed a fairly coherent picture. Dangerous ex-husband pursues frightened wife, mysterious benefactor intervenes, dangerous ex-husband is stopped. Clean. Satisfying. But reality, as anyone who has lived in it long enough can tell you, is almost never that clean. The truth that emerged in the next 30 minutes at gate H14 was not simpler than what appeared on the surface. It was exponentially more complicated. And it began with a name on the manifest that nobody, including James Park, had expected to see. His name, listed on the flight roster under a corporation called KSW Global Logistics, was Raymond Yoon. James Park knew that name. He knew it the way you know the name of a storm that nearly destroyed something you built, not with fondness, not with fear exactly, but with the cold recognition of someone who has studied a threat carefully and never entirely stopped watching for it. Raymond Yoon was not merely a passenger on the 1145. He was the reason the 1145 existed as a meeting point. Raymond Yoon was, in the architecture of the organization that Marcus Webb worked alongside, the man at the center. And the fact that his name was on this manifest meant one thing with absolute clarity: Marcus Webb had not come to Chicago to retrieve his wife. He had come to deliver her, or more precisely, to deliver what she was carrying, to Raymond Yoon. James told Danny to find out where Raymond Yoon was physically located in the airport. Danny found him 12 minutes later. Yoon was in the Delta Sky Club on the upper level of the H concourse, 40 feet above the terminal floor, with a clear sightline to gate H14 through the floor-to-ceiling glass wall. He had been watching the entire time. He would have seen Marcus's search. He would have seen Marcus lose the phone signal. And now, because James and Rachel had moved to the gate area and Rachel was seated in a manner that partially obscured her from above, Yoon had not yet confirmed whether she was there or not. The window of uncertainty was narrow. And it was closing. James sat back down near Rachel. For the first time since she had stepped behind him in the terminal, he told her not just what to do, but why. He explained, in 3 quiet sentences, that the man she had married had been using their shared life, their home, their accounts, their address, their very legitimate and documented existence together, as a layer of cover for money that belonged to a criminal structure operating across 3 countries. He told her that the flash drive she was carrying contained, almost certainly, documentation that could dismantle a significant portion of that structure. And he told her that the reason Marcus Webb had followed her to Chicago, booked a seat on her flight, and deployed a second person as backup was not because he loved her or wanted her back. It was because Raymond Yoon had given him a deadline, and the deadline was today. Rachel didn't cry when he said this. She had done most of her crying already, in the previous year, in increments she had parceled out carefully so they didn't overwhelm her. What she felt in that moment was something quieter and stranger, a kind of terrible clarity. All those years. All those inexplicable business trips. All those locked doors and quiet conversations in another room and amounts of money moving in ways that never quite made sense even when Marcus explained them. It hadn't been hiding. It had been infrastructure. And she had been, without knowing it, part of what made that infrastructure look normal. She had been, she now understood, not just his wife. She had been his alibi. And now she was his liability. She looked at James Park. She said, "Why are you helping me?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that, looking back, tells you everything you need to know about who James Park actually was beneath the composed exterior and the complicated reputation. He said, "Because Raymond Yoon took something from my family a long time ago. And because you don't deserve to be the price someone else pays for their mistakes. That sentence is worth sitting with. Because what James was telling her, without explaining the full history, without getting into the details of what Yoon's organization had done to the Park family more than a decade earlier, was that this moment, this strange and terrible convergence in a Chicago airport terminal, was not entirely coincidental. James Park had known, for years, that Raymond Yoon's operation used American domestic cover, legitimate-seeming businesses, clean addresses, ordinary-looking partners, to insulate its international activity. He had built his own understanding of that operation carefully, over time. He had not known that Marcus Webb was part of that cover. He had not known that Rachel Monroe existed. But the moment the name Raymond Yoon appeared on that manifest, James had understood that something was in motion. And the frightened woman who had pressed herself against his back had just told him, without knowing it, exactly what that something was. Boarding began at 11:22. The gate agent, Karen, called for passengers requiring additional time first, which is standard. Then she called for first-class passengers. And in the middle of that announcement, by prior arrangement, Rachel Monroe walked to the jet bridge door with James Park beside her and boarded the aircraft. Not because she was first class, but because Karen had been quietly briefed, and because the two plainclothes officials now positioned near the gate had been given a reason to ensure that boarding at H-14 proceeded in a particular order on this particular morning. Marcus Webb, standing near the gate entrance, did not see Rachel board. He was looking, at that exact moment, at his phone, which had just received a message from Raymond Yoon upstairs, asking for a status update. By the time Marcus looked up, the jet bridge door had closed behind her. What happened to Marcus Webb in the next 11 minutes is a matter of documented record, though the details of how it was set in motion remain appropriately ambiguous. What we know is this: the active surveillance of a passenger's mobile device, without consent and without legal authorization, is a federal crime under the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. The fact that Marcus Webb's phone contained software capable of real-time GPS tracking of Rachel's device, software that was active, that was running, and that investigators were able to document within minutes of being granted access, gave the plainclothes officials at Gate H-14 more than enough cause to ask Marcus to step aside. He was calm when they approached him. He was always calm. He went with them without making a scene. Because Marcus Webb understood, better than most, that making a scene at the wrong moment costs more than it gains. Raymond Yoon left the Sky Club 7 minutes after Marcus was detained. He walked to a rideshare pickup location at the lower level of Terminal 3, got into a car, and was gone. He was not detained that day. The reach of James Park's contacts extended to what could be accomplished quickly, in a contained space, with a specific evidentiary basis. It did not, at that moment, extend to Raymond Yoon himself. That would come later. Months later. Through channels that had nothing to do with an airport and everything to do with the flash drive that Rachel Monroe had been unknowingly carrying in the lining of her carry-on bag for 9 months. But that part of the story belongs to a different chapter. On the plane, Rachel sat in seat 24C. James Park sat in 24A, the window seat, though it was not the seat listed on his original boarding pass. He had requested the change quietly. They didn't talk much during the flight. There was a kind of exhaustion between them that was also, strangely, something close to relief, the particular quiet that follows a crisis when the crisis has not destroyed you. At some point, over Wisconsin, Rachel took the flash drive out of her bag and held it in her palm and looked at it. She said to James, "What do I do with this?" He said, "That's your decision to make. But I know people who would make sure it ends up where it can do the most good." She looked at the flash drive for another few seconds. Then she said, "Okay." Just that. One word. Okay. She landed in Portland at 2:47 in the afternoon, Pacific Time. Her sister Diane was waiting at arrivals. Diane was 41, slightly taller than Rachel, with their father's dark eyes and a laugh that had always made Rachel feel like she was 12 years old again and nothing had gone too far wrong yet. When Rachel came through the arrival's door with her carry-on bag and her face still carrying the remnants of a morning she would spend a long time processing, Diane took one look at her and just opened her arms. Rachel walked into them and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed. The cedar smell was gone. The airport noise was gone. She was, for the first time in a very long time, somewhere that felt like it might actually be safe. And it was. In the months that followed, the flash drive was transferred, through the proper, legal channels, with the assistance of an attorney Rachel found with James Park's recommendation, to federal investigators who were already running a parallel inquiry into the financial network that Raymond Young's organization had built across the American Midwest. The documents Rachel had copied from Marcus's laptop, documents she hadn't even fully understood at the time, turned out to be the kind of detailed internal records that investigators rarely get access to through any means other than extraordinary luck or extraordinary bravery. Depending on how you look at it, what Rachel had done, copying those files on a quiet evening while looking for a tax document, was both of those things at once. Marcus Webb was formally charged on 3 counts, including unauthorized computer surveillance and conspiracy to commit financial fraud. Raymond Young's organization faced a separate federal indictment that would take 2 more years to fully develop. James Park returned to his life, his legitimate businesses, his board meetings, his private obligations, with the same composure he had carried into O'Hare that Tuesday morning. He and Rachel exchanged a handful of messages over the following months. Never anything long. Never anything dramatic. Mostly just updates. Practical information. The quiet, careful correspondence of 2 people who had been through something unusual together and weren't entirely sure what category to put it in. What he said, in one message sent 4 months after the airport, was this: "I hope you're teaching again." She was. She had found a position at an elementary school in the Selwood neighborhood of Portland, 20 minutes from Diane's house, working with 3rd graders. On the first day, a boy in the 3rd row had raised his hand and asked her what her favorite thing about teaching was. Rachel had thought about it for a real moment, not the polished answer, not the one that sounded right, but the actual answer. She'd said, "My favorite thing is when someone finally believes that what they have to say matters." The boy had nodded very seriously, as if this confirmed something he had been wondering about. And Rachel had felt, for the first time in a long time, like herself. So here we are. At the end of a story that started with a woman too frightened to cross a terminal floor and a man who had every reason to look away and chose not to. And we want to ask you something, genuinely ask you, because this is the kind of story that doesn't finish when the video ends. It stays with you. It asks questions of you on a Tuesday evening when you're doing nothing in particular and your mind wanders back to it. Here is the question we want you to sit with: James Park was not a simple person. He moved through a complicated world. He made choices in his life that most of us would not make. And yet, in that airport, in that moment, he was the one who created the space for Rachel to survive. Does that make him a good person? Does his past matter less because of what he did that morning? Or does it matter more? There is no clean answer. And that's exactly the point. Tell us in the comments what you think. We genuinely want to know. We live in a world that wants its moral categories clear. The villain over there. The hero over here. The victim in the middle. But real life, the life that actually happens, in actual airports, in actual marriages, in actual moments of crisis, doesn't organize itself that way. Rachel was not just a victim. She made decisions, some of them before she even knew what she was deciding, that took real courage. Marcus was not a cartoon. He was someone who had made choices, gradually, then completely, that led him somewhere he couldn't find his way back from. James Park was not a savior in any uncomplicated sense. He was a man who saw something that reminded him of something, and acted. And the result, for one person on one morning, was that she got to board the plane. Think about the people in your own life who showed up for you in unexpected ways. Think about the moments when you were the person who could have helped and chose to walk by instead. We all have both kinds of moments. That is not an indictment. It's just true. If you were standing where Rachel stood that morning, if the person you were most afraid of walked into the same terminal, and a stranger offered you shelter without asking a single question, would you have taken it? Would you have trusted someone you didn't know, in a moment where trusting the wrong person could cost you everything? Drop your answer in the comments. Because your perspective matters, and the conversation in this community is always worth reading. If this story moved you in any way, hit the like button. It costs you nothing and it helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we have more coming, and the next one will leave you with just as many questions. And one last thing before you go, if there is someone in your life right now who is going through something hard and trying not to show it, reach out to them today. Not tomorrow. Today. You might be the stranger at the airport that changes everything. Take care of each other out there. We'll see you in the next one.